Today, I wanted to do something positive again for Pixar, considering that Disney has never really done so for the past few months. And that, my friend, is to explore the reason why, for the most part, that Pixar managed to make their twist villains work. I mean, for years now, especially on what I touched in my Disney specific video, the world has discussed the alarming issue that resulted in mediocre villains that have came out of Disney that really hampered their stories so much that they stopped really having them altogether at this point. Where thankfully, it looks like that is about to change, at least for Disney, where Pixar at this point, in their latest releases like Elemental, doesn't really have villains anymore either. Which is sad to think about it, but okay, considering that they always manage to make their stories work with or without villains, except for a few. It's something I went through briefly when I talked about the Disney villains in the Pixar segment that worked well, but felt the urge to expand upon it considering they have been doing it so successfully for many years for a longer time, with a bigger list than what Disney has been doing, where they too somehow suffered the same exact problem that Walt Disney Animation Studios had in the mid-2010s that transferred to them in the late 2010s to early 2020s when it pertained to twist villainy. So this video is meant to go specifically into why Pixar's one succeeded well and also failed, and how the studio generally knows how to create good stories even if it seems like they aren't the same powerhouse most expected them to be 10 years ago. So to start, we of course have to highlight the problem with Pixar's modern villains that I have mentioned in my previous Disney video. It's where I constantly mention The Incredibles 2 and Lightyear, extremely mediocre stories with the worst twist villains I have ever seen. Because when we take a look at The Incredibles, they are a superhero family story which warrants them having super villains. This is where people sort of say that Syndrome kind of acts as a twist villain and a prelude to Evelyn because he is shown to be the mastermind of Mr. Incredible's new superhero job with the Omnidroids and the fact he was his biggest fan in the prologue. This is not as much as a twist villain for us in the audience's eyes because we already see his tragic background with Mr. Incredible putting him down in the beginning, which made him understand that it was him when he was revealed to Mr. Incredible, where to Mr. Incredible, he is the twist of his very story, not knowing that this kid who is smart could ever turn out like this because of the consequence of his own actions and his ignorance. It's one that works well because it is virtually the origin story of the supervillain, which is what heroes have to go against constantly. He's not physically powerful, but he makes up for it in his mind to invent weapons amongst other things. It matches the world it tries to portray in this situation. And when you pertain something like that in The Incredibles 2, it doesn't work because it tries to use the Disney formula of villains by making the least obvious choice throughout the entire film, which doesn't match up because when it comes to superheroes, there is going to be an obvious threat lined up in the story and not surprise you in any way, which is exactly what Evelyn did, where it was kind of predictable that they were going for since they were the ones running the show from the start to bring back the super campaign. I mean, even if she wasn't a villain, I didn't think the Screenslaver was going to be quite interesting as a villain, but still much better in the focus compared to just her, because it really never led up to those events in the story considering what she was doing and what her plans were revealed to be when the twist came in. Because this all comes from the most stupidest background and vendetta where her father was an advocate for supers and just put too much trust in them when they were forced to go underground at the same time when he could have went below for safety when his house was being robbed, which somehow translated into her own character to rail against supers for some reason, which she constantly sabotaged herself by helping her brother and Elastigirl out. It just didn't make any sense because everything she does establish a connection with her and never warranted anything to happen at all because they did eventually sign the thing that helps supers rather than trying to stop it like she was doing to say that supers were bad. A weaker version of Syndrome trying to help people realize how useless they are and that they could be super on their own. Like, how the hell did she not realize that the law was intact the whole time that she wanted to keep? She didn't need to help them out at all because it never worked towards her plans, never really needing to work with her brother to do this and then directly sabotage his attempts instead of helping them out from the very beginning. It's so stupid and shallow and seems like an easier way to finish the story you didn't really plan out well beyond focusing on the important family points. One that Disney just took out of their own playbook and put into Pixar since they knew this film was going to be highly anticipated since it was a film that made over $1.2 billion. But nobody now actually looks back upon it fondly or even care for, which is kind of strange considering its success, but now it's really the most mediocre Pixar film you could ever expect. It's a story without any rhyme or reason for it to exist and clearly showed upon Evelyn's character that ruined the whole point of everything that the Incredibles stand for. This example never worked because the world of the Incredibles was never meant for that type of villain to work with. It's a world of supers, heroes or villains, and she does not fit that type and wasn't built up to be in the events of the film with the most idiotic motivations to why she has to do it. And this problem once again relied in Lightyear as another movie based upon a huge property that never worked. Because anyone who's seen anything that relates to the Toy Story knows that that Zurg is a large villain in Buzz's world, which was something actually discussed by him in the first film, because in Toy Story he discussed how Emperor Zurg is building a weapon like the Death Star that can destroy planets and he has to stop him. It's here in the background of Buzz Lightyear that shows that Zurg is an evil tyrant and emperor out to stop the likes of whoever opposes his will, including Star Command, where he is Buzz's nemesis. But the film known as Lightyear went with Buzz as Zurg instead, as an older version of Buzz himself, to twist the story instead of the evil Emperor Zurg, and that didn't make any sense for the entire audience, including the kids who watched the film. It's something that really hampers any meaning to anyone who knows Toy Story at all, who are the main audience that is watching Lightyear. This version has a Zurg that is just named that way because the robots cannot say Buzz properly from some reason in the future, who is doing nothing but fixing a mistake of the past to continue on with the mission. And yeah, that is the fault of the entire story relying on Lightyear as the focus instead of the story being what it actually wanted to be. It is an actual Pixar story that had Lightyear slapped as an IP onto it to sell it as a film. We could have had something original, but they just had to do it to sell it to the public, and it's why the movie is actually sucked in all regards, when films like Turning Red actually deserve that release in theaters. Like, you don't justify this existing because the story isn't based around that. Why can't we have Zurg as just the regular villain we know him as? Why are you twisting him to be an older Buzz? It's just so stupid, and just better to have Buzz Lightyear of Star Command as a movie in this animated form rather than the boring crap we got. So you kind of see in these two cases it doesn't work because the story of where they are based upon cannot warrant them having these twists at all. They can have twist villains in some way, but it has to make sense within the overall story. The definition we have talked about regarding these types of villains are that they are more clear from the start to be the villain rather than not having them exist till the third act of the film, like only 30 minutes before the movie ends without no build up whatsoever. And that's really unfortunate because Cars 2 actually somehow made it work better than these two in their story, because this is one that actually suffers from a similar problem from these two and started all of Pixar's problems, but still okay considering the crap story that the movie brought. Its villain fits because this movie sucks, because when it comes to Cars 2's villain, it's all trying to be based around this stupid ass spy plot that the movie wanted to focus on, which happens to be the billionaire Miles Axelrod, who promotes the race during the events of the film and the alternative fuels that they use, while secretly plotting to ruin that to keep using oil instead. This both does and does not work for the movie because of how stupid it is. Having this grand figure behind the scenes for the most part, who turns out to be responsible as figured out by Mater because of his own background and generally safe attitude about things happening during the course of the world tour. But of course, in vain with the previous two, the circumstances are completely stupid and do not make any sense at all, like Evelyn Dever with this guy, Axelrod, having a position that could actually work out well for them, but they just become the most dumbest villains ever, ruining everything about themselves. Why can't you just make money on this alternative fuel and just use that oil instead? Why do you need to do this? Why do you need to actually blow up cars for some reason? All this teaches us is that Cars 2 is even worse than you originally thought, and how this plot with this twist doesn't work within the context of the world. But at the very least, it kind of actually worked, because there were various circumstances during Mater's reveal of him that made sense for him having the villainous twist work out, but it just didn't work out overall because the movie kind of sucked. And with those facts out of the way comes the variety of stories that do work, which actually justify their twist really well within the context of their various stories. This starts us back out with Stinky Pete in Toy Story 2, where I would also like to grab Lotso from Toy Story 3 in that mix to how great Toy Story films were with their villains, because both of these villains have actually something to say within the story of Toy Story that works so well within its own messaging. Stinky Pete is at first presented as this toy that's never been opened, kept fresh in the box where other toys like Sputnik took off during the space race. Here we understand where he's coming from, which eventually justifies his turn to complete antagonism in the third act. The same can be said for Lotso, who is represented as this huggable bear and the kind leader of the toys at the daycare, promising kids for generations for toys to be played with to keep their purpose forever. And this is understandable from within the background of him misunderstanding, like Pete did, that he never wanted to be played with, where in the case of Lotso, he had an owner where her parents actually forgot about the toys, where he thought that was actually Daisy forgetting about him, where he was eventually replaced, and that she never loved him anymore because of this very mistake. So you can understand that both in Pete's and Lotso's background comes from this notion of being forgotten or abandoned by kids no longer having that purpose to feel justified in their positions. Pete in this case wanted to force Woody to join them because of this bitterness, where compared to Lotso, he wasn't just played with, so he didn't know what that was like, developing this attitude of solitariness because nobody wanted to play with him or his box. He was just grown around this environment that isolated him from these different points of view, which was also solidified by how Jesse experienced being being abandoned by her owner, similar to Lotso in that regard, where it's not just from the perspective of the villains themselves, but also our other heroes, which kinda makes the twist work a lot more. I mean, this also works because he isn't inherently evil either, which is a problem that Disney twist villains like Hans and Bellwether had with their overly villainous attitude after their reveals for some reason that didn't make any sense, where he is understanding trying to connect with Woody and Jessie at first, but turning against that where his own view is challenged when Woody tries to go back home with Jessie. His inexperience in this situation is everything, and that's what makes his defeat much more sweet because how he is now forced to get a new owner by the end of the film, which through other content online and the wiki actually suggests that he grew to love, so virtually he became reformed in that case of his own defeat. So this twist works well because of how Toy Story 2 overall questions the purpose of a toy when their owner would actually grow to forget them, like what happens in Toy Story 3 when we see through Lotso. Because like I said earlier, this is where we learn to understand his background much more clearly, where you at first get the impression that he is the overall villain by the action of placing them in the caterpillar room and seeing that revealed later on when they capture Buzz and don't allow him to bring others in to reprogram him to be their servant, keeping this order within his system he designed for him, where it all comes from this bitterness of being forgotten, where he just wants to be so selfish to have all the love where newer toys get left to rot. The main reason this twist works is because of how we automatically already know this before it is officially revealed by the experiences with the younger kids in the caterpillar room compared to the gentle ones that care for toys in the butterfly room. And all of this just works so well in the end because instead of Stinky Pete getting defeated by becoming a child's plaything finally, he finally gets to rot in front of a garbage truck while catching flies because of what he did. He gets the spotlight once again, but he is forced to spend time rotting within the stink of garbage, not being played with at all because he already selfishly took that from others. Toy Story sequels, for the most part, get what they should need from a twist villain because it perfectly fits their own backgrounds from the very beginning of the story. And this leads us to the rest of Pixar's golden age with stories like Monsters Inc. that really continue it. I really discussed this too in the Disney video where you can understand the position characters like Waternoose are in with the energy crisis that is going on throughout the events of the film. I mean, it really doesn't need to have him as the villain because Randall actually did that just fine from the very beginning, but it really did make the decision to have him as a twist villain stand out a lot more from the very beginning, because at the very start of the film, he establishes the dangers of children entering the human world, but needs to do the job he needs to do to scare children because it powers the monster world overall. And during the course of the film, we see events putting the company and the world of monsters under some tough times because children don't scare as they used to, and they need to act fast to stop that problem and uphold the company that has been his family for generations. How he's desperate to keep all of that afloat because that is his legacy. And because we see that add up, it makes his twist work with Randall because of how desperate he had become to save that by banishing Mike and Sully so he could save everything, kidnapping and using children to suck the power out of them. It's another situation where he isn't outright evil because he is desperate in the situation and hates Randall for forcing him to banish Sully, who he actually liked more than Randall, and thinking he is less than Sully in every single way, which of course Randall hates. Where you can see it's just under good intentions of providing for the public, but done in a very inexcusable way. One that gets progressively worse because of how desperate we see he has become when he of course says his most infamous line,
"I'll kidnap 1,000 children before I let this company die."
It's a real act that solidifies his twist really well because of the lengths he was willing to go beyond what is morally and lawfully right in the world, where of course they arrest him in the end, thinking that all is lost, blaming Sully for the problem, which it actually turns out to be wrong by the end of the film. So Monsters work for its twist because of the setup of events that results in desperation to solve a crucial problem in their world that they all depend on. This leads us up next to of course Charles Muntz from Up, and this one works well more than the previous ones on this list because we already see at the beginning how he's established as much of an inspiration to Carl on these newsreels searching for this lost bird and whatnot through his journey through Paradise Falls. And by the end of the reel, we don't know if he's going to be alive or not, if he is going to be important to the overall story other than the fact he inspires Carl and Ellie's character. We are not led to believe if he's very important to the overall story, as it is more geared towards Carl and leading his life on without the love and adventure that was his wife. Where of course during the events of the film he gets caught up with Russell and Kevin in that picture, where you might start to understand what is going on when our first twist is revealed that Charles Muntz is alive with an entire group of talking dogs he programmed. Like I said in the beginning, this is where you didn't know if he was going to be alive or not, but given these small clues to how it was going to work out considering his search for the bird from the very beginning, which does look like Kevin when we get the skeleton. This builds us to our next twist when we go through his collection of exotic animals on his journey, where his search for this one bird was actually driving him insane, and makes this twist that reveals him that he is the villain much more sweeter by the tone they actually set up in this very scene. Dark but lit by his lantern pattern, revealing that he has killed people along his search. Everything is built up by these twists in quick succession because of how long he has actually spent chasing Kevin throughout his entire life, enough where society has already forgotten about him completely in the background. This has two twists that work really well for a twist villain, one revealing that he is alive and the other one revealing that he went insane chasing a bird no matter the cost, willing to kill an old man and a child to get it eventually, which of course causes his own very demise. It's a situation where you also think he already died a long time ago chasing after something that never actually wanted to be found to begin with, where it just works so well in the overall story of adventure to realize what is right in front of you. And before we get into our final villain, I would actually like to add Otto from WALL-E a bit in that conversation, because I think he goes unnoticed in the grand scheme of the movie, because if we realize what is happening and where everyone is at, then we can see this twist working well to a degree. Because throughout WALL-E, we already established that the background of the film shows that humans left due to their own negligence through mega corporations like by and large controlling everything and trashing Earth. We see this reflected in the past throughout the live action scenes of the film, showcasing that humanity of old and before and during the time we started to lose our way, and then contrasting that to the axiom with the animated humans. Where, side note, if they did actually live action remakes of these very films, it would totally ruin the point of this to begin with, since this is already in live action technically. Because here you already get the sense that Otto is the villain because of how he's designed similar to HAL 9000 and the robotic voice he has. But this is a fact that is not clear for the humans in the film like Captain McCrea, because they've already been accustomed to everything as directed by what Otto was assigned to do because of the hubris of other humans like Shelby Forthright, who failed to clean up Earth for the return home, directed to stay the course in space where no human seems to notice or care this happened to them at all. The twist here overall is how humanity gave up on Earth and how their complacency made them stay up here and force directives onto their autopilots to keep them all in space, hence why the twist against Captain McCrea is done well in a mutiny to keep it that way and not return home under any circumstances. These events were actually directly led by the humanity of old themselves. His design may be shallow, but it is a massive reflection on ourselves for being ignorant and the reliance on technology giving up what we should care for. It works well because the world was built around that thinking, hence why this scene made him a sort of twist villain that worked well within the world of WALL-E. And of course, this leads us back with our last great twist villain for Pixar in Ernesto de la Cruz. Like the rest, he is introduced very early on in his own story, being the most greatest musician in all of Mexican history, and of course led Miguel to believe that he is his great-great-grandfather because of this background. And when we see him again, when Miguel still believes him to be as this very guy, he is presented as very charming and friendly, who encourages others to follow their dreams no matter what others say. The things he says to Miguel is something that resonates with him, believing in his passion where others don't really believe in them. He constantly presents this genuine light, willing to help Miguel, and is something that works better than what Disney has provided for other characters like Hans to be in that same charm. Where here, he is the central focus for a reason rather than being slapped into his villainy because they changed the story around. This is because during the course of the movie, Miguel spends time with Hector, where we get to see that he and Ernesto were actually best friends, and how he explained that all of his songs that he sang were actually ones that he wrote. This changes everything because, like Miguel, we were led to believe that they were all Ernesto's songs, that he was the admired musician who pursued his dreams and developed his talents that made him successful until this very moment where we finally get to see the flashbacks to that night that begins the twist. They were friends pursuing a dream together, but Hector just wanted to go home, but Ernesto was just so desperate to succeed because of how good Hector was that he willingly killed him to steal that and obtain the opportunities to succeed without zero the effort, claiming everything as his own. We see that the twist works well because he already attained the victory as a villain by stealing off of his own friend and poisoning him to be where he is at, finally revealing the truth where now it leads him to sustain his position, keeping Miguel here because he always thinks you have to do whatever it takes to seize your moment, revealing his true selfish vain ambitions to be the pride of the public. It changes things for the rest of the film because we do actually realize who he was inside that was there all along. That makes perfect sense rather than the ones introduced with no rhyme or reason to the world, because he was in the limelight from the very beginning. They put him in the spotlight to highlight how adored he was in the public, and then realizing that that was all a lie stolen from Miguel's true family and Hector that was eventually exposed through their own actions that changed the perception as we saw on stage that led to his second second death by the bell, aware of it this time that solidified his fate rather than a simple accident from the first time before. So we can see it worked well because of the events of the film that surrounded him and the perspective people had that finally changed things to see the truth at the very end. All in all, Pixar for the most part knew how to make the twist villains work because they knew what they needed to do in the overall story and message of their own very films, where nowadays they unfortunately switched to the problem that Disney had with their very latest film that actually had a villain. And that's sad to see because currently the other stories that are being released right now through Pixar don't actually have villain anymore. In Elemental, that was obvious from the trailers, but it's not overall bad because their stories are still good enough to stand on their own, but just hope that they could return in them because they really straighten the overall goal when they actually do try and not pertain it to a sequel or spin-off of other previous properties. With that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.